Do you see the right screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, brilliant. So GDPR in NMR, what does it mean? So everyone knows GDPR. It's a general data protection regulation. It concerns personal data and processing of personal data of EU citizens. It's probably the toughest privacy and security law in the world. It was put into effect in 2018, so it applies since many years. And it applies to the entire EU, including UK, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, in effect. And there's also hefty fines if it's violated. So just a few definitions. Personal data, what is that? Personal data is any information that relates to an individual who can be directly or indirectly identified. And that means, of course, that we all work with personal data in one way or another. Let's see. So here is then the first question that comes up: anonymization or pseudonymization. And it's actually quite simple. If you cannot identify the person, it is actually anonymized data, and that is then out of the scope of the GDPR. And interestingly enough, also for the biobanks, any sample that is in the biobank has to be possible to connect to a person, so that cannot be anonymized in that sense. Pseudonymization, many people try to sort of escape and say, okay, we use pseudonymized data, so it doesn't apply to us. But it's not really the question of whether you can identify the person from pseudonymized data. It's whether the person can be identified at all. And if it's pseudonymized, by definition, the person can be identified. So this applies with GDPR. And then there's a few other things. Data processing. What is data processing? It's essentially anything that you do with the data. It means collecting, recording, organizing, structuring, storing, using, erasing. So essentially, as much as look at the data, you are processing it. The data subject is, of course, a person whose data is processed. The data controller is the person in your organization who decides on how the personal data will be processed. And if you work together with a PI at your own university, this is not so much of a problem. The PI is, of course, a data controller. But the question is, of course, when you are the data processor, that is when you process personal data on behalf of a data controller who is at a different university or a different legal entity. And that means that there are special rules for that as well. So the basic principles for personal data is quite simple. There has to be some kind of legal ground for this. It should be fairness and transparent. The purpose for data should, of course, be sort of adhered, and you shouldn't expand the use of personal data during course of time. It should be minimal. You should only collect and process data as much as required. It should be correct and accurate and also kept safe by you. There are storage limitations. You're not allowed to keep it for longer than absolutely necessary. But then, of course, also processing has to comply with integrity and confidentiality and accountability. The data controller is actually responsible to be able to demonstrate that the use of data actually complies with all these principles. That's actually the responsibility of the data controller. So this is for general for general personal data. But then there's a different class of personal data, and that is the sensitive personal data. And what is sensitive personal data? And that is when the personal data refers to racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, membership of a trade union, health, person's sex life or sexual orientation, genetic data, biometric data, and so on. And in this respect, from an NMR case, do we actually handle sensitive personal data? And the answer is, of course, yes. If we do NMR-based metabolomics, we actually analyze human biomaterial, biofluids, tissue extracts, you name it. And this provides information on health and drug abuse, for instance. So for sure, if we do NMR-based metabolomics, we do handle sensitive personal data. And then all this applies again with lawfulness, purpose, and data minimization, and so on. But now it is a bit more strict in this sense. So the lawfulness for handling sensitive personal data, there is now special requirements that needs to be fulfilled. And essentially, there's only two. This is in the public interest in the field of public health. You can read here epidemiology and maybe COVID-19 vaccination and stuff like that. But there is also, of course, a scientific purpose that is valid. And the scientific purpose is one that we sort of rely on when we do NMR-based metabolomics. But then also the other points need to be fulfilled. And this is now where it becomes slightly more complex in this case. So, of course, personal data, you should be able to show and delete on demand if the person asks for that. Data and metadata should be sort of fair and minimal. But then, of course, the reception of metadata should be secure. So when the PI sends you the list of maybe the coded list, pseudonymized list for the subjects, this cannot take place via regular email. Acquired data should not be left on spectrometer hard drives for general access. So how do you delete that immediately after you've recorded it and transferred it to a secure server? And access to the stored data should be actually secure. For instance, multi-factor authorization and also some kind of safe system where everyone has not access to that server. And anything you do with that should be traceable, and all the events when you work with that should be logged. Analysis of data should be also in a secure environment, meaning when you do analysis, transforming spectra, whatever, again, this applies with multi-factor authorization, events are logged and so on. And of course, you cannot do that on the spectrometer. You cannot do that on your own PC. You cannot take this home and work with that. This has to be sort of on a different level. So any sort of cheap solution here, I think, is impossible. You have to work with your IT department to make this work. Transfer of data should follow the same principles. So when you transfer data to a PI, for instance, or to a company, again, multi-factor authorization, secure, logged, traceable. And then when you are finished, data should be erased as soon as possible. And then, of course, there is restrictions on the transfer of personal data outside EU. So essentially, it's impossible to process or transfer data or store on servers in US or China, because those servers, they follow a different set of legal rules, and that is not acceptable. So this is actually a whole range of aspects that come into place in this case. So the R-NMR and the GDPR question, what we're supposed to do, we will review the GDPR aspects, and we will actually just try to tap in and ask you how you handle collection, processing, analysis, storing, reporting, and so on, in a brief survey. And I think, like this to be anonymous for obvious reasons, because essentially we ask if you violate the GDPR. And of course, GDPR, that applies, the fines only apply to the bad guys and cannot really be applicable to universities, right? Well, Greenwich was fined already in May 2018. University was fined 2020. University College of Dublin was fined 2021. So these are fines that already has been sort of applied to universities. So we are not exempt in that sense, even if we believe that we are essentially the good guys. So I'll stop sharing here.